The technique of forgiveness is simple. Not very difficult to manage when you understand how. The only thing that is essential is the willingness to forgive. That's the foundation for the whole thing. The willingness to forgive. The very second that you are willing to forgive, then the forgiveness is easy. It's like you've heard me say so many times that the only person that Jesus cannot help, the only person whose sins cannot be forgiven, is the person who won't confess that he's a sinner. When you're willing to confess, Jesus stands right there. He's more willing to forgive you than you are to forgive. So when it comes to your forgiveness of another, the big step is your willingness to forgive. And provided you desire to forgive the offender, the greater part of the work is already done. People have always made such a big thing out of forgiveness because they have been laboring under the impression that to forgive a person means that you are compelled to just love him and go all overboard and be gushy over the whole thing. I don't know how any better to describe it. Now, you know something? Jesus never said anything about that. Happily, this is by no means the case. We are not called upon to like everyone whom we do not find ourselves liking spontaneously. And indeed, it's quite impossible to force ourselves to like people. You can no more force yourself to love somebody than you can hold the winds in your fist. And when you, on the surface, have to force yourself to love somebody, when you are acting this love towards somebody, you're being deceitful. That's just plain deceit. That's all. Jesus isn't talking about that at all. No, ma'am. Not at all. People used to think that when someone had hurt them very much, it was their duty as good Christians to pump it up, as it were, a feeling of liking him, of loving him, gushing over him. But since such a thing is utterly impossible, they suffered a great deal of distress and ended the whole thing with failure. And the result was nothing more or less than deceit. We're not obliged to like everyone, but we are under a binding obligation to love everyone, a love that the Bible calls charity, meaning a vivid sense of impersonal goodwill. I think that's the best way that I can describe it. Sure. It's just an impersonal goodwill. This has nothing directly to do with the feelings, though it is always followed sooner or later by a wonderful feeling of peace and happiness. Sure, that's somebody that gets on your nerves. You see, you don't have to have the same feeling towards them if there's a conflict in personality that you have with somebody that you're in perfect harmony with when it comes to personality. There's some folk that you just naturally love. Now, you're not going to get any credit and glory for loving that person. No, if you think you're going to get any reward by loving that somebody who's so easy to love. And you personally have checked that up on your account and say, now look, I love her now. Surely my love for her offsets my dislike for the other. Doesn't work that way. You're going to get no credit for loving the folks who are easy to love. But here's that somebody who's a thorn in your flesh. That's what Jesus is talking about. There is a place in him where instead of looking for the bad points in them, look for the good. Just look for the good. And if you really knew that person, and you really knew some of the deep waters they were going through, and you really understood some of their suffering, if you really, truly learned to know that one, you'd find yourself helping that one instead of condemning. I have been so ashamed of myself. Oh, I have felt so ashamed of myself. I remember once there was a custodian in Oil City, Pennsylvania. He was the custodian of an auditorium where I was renting. That man was the meanest man. I found myself just staying just as far away from him as I possibly could. He was so... Everybody, I wasn't the only one, who thought he was impossible. Mean. Till one day, I bumped right into him. He bared his soul to me, and he told me that his wife was dying of cancer. They couldn't afford a nurse. She was at home. And that he would work all day and then would stay up and take care of his sick wife all night. He was working, holding down that job. He had to hold down the job because the bills had to be paid. The doctor had to be taken care of. He was working 9-10 hours as a custodian, meeting the public, on not more than an hour and a half and 2 hours of sleep. That's the reason he was grumpy and grouchy and had the kind of a disposition. You know something? I got to liking that man more than I could begin to tell you, because I had learned to know him. And then inside of me there was such a nice peace whenever I talked with him, and I didn't shun him anymore. To really understand, to really know, is to love and to forgive. The method of forgiving is just this. Get by yourself, become quiet, and say, now, I loose my enemy. I let him go. I completely forgive this whole business in question. As far as I'm concerned, it's finished. It's over forever. I cast the burden of resentment upon the Christ within me. I wish him well in every phase of his life. The incident is finished. Is finished. Then get up from your knees and go about your business. On no account repeat this act of forgiveness, because you have done it once and for all. It's done, it's closed, it's buried, it's forgotten, it's forgiven. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. Amen.